All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Dev Empathy Book Club, where we inspire each other to become better developers and better people by building our empathy skills. Today, we'll be doing our first walkthrough of the Pragmatic Programmer, part one. I think we're going through roughly the first couple of chapters. There's the book for reference.
Here's the book right here.
We were just joking off air that it's helpful that it's available online as well if you need to do some reference. So before we dive into anything specific from the book, Ariel, can you tell me your initial thoughts on the book? Is this your first time reading it? What were your thinking? What were your thinking around, diving into it for this time?
This is my first time reading it. It's definitely not the first time that I've heard a lot of the ideas here. One thing which I thought was really fascinating was the idea of event-driven systems is becoming very, very popular recently. A lot of that probably has to do with, with the just emergence of JavaScript as a very dominant platform for development in all kinds of environments. And so, with JavaScript, right, the evented model is very compelling. It was really cool to see that someone was talking about this, quite some time ago. This makes sense for a lot of different reasons. And it's not like some hot new thing somebody just discovered. It's this stuff has been around for a while. I gotta say, initially I was a little bit off put by certain elements at the beginning of the book. I found there was a lot of should language, like you should do this, you should do that. There were a good amount of assumptions about the kind of people who would be reading the book. And we can dive into some of that as we go. At the same time, there's a lot of really solid wisdom in there. And I think the reason that we're doing this book as part of the club, it wasn't the most obvious choice for a club that's really focused on soft skills. But I think the point is that the technical skills and the soft skills are not so far apart. A lot of the things that we do, even in our day-to-day coding, should be based on our understanding of people. And I think that rather than going to details now, I think we'll let that discussion play out as we go on. How about you, Justin?
So this is my second foray into this book. I read it in 2012-ish, which I was about to say is 4 years ago, and it's definitely not 4 years ago. I remember really enjoying it then and being kind of like, oh, wow, yeah, this makes total sense, and kind of just eating it up. But going back through it the second time, I do agree with you about a lot of the assumptions in the language in the beginning. That was like, oh, I didn't notice that the first time I read this. But reading it this time, it made me realize how much of these things are just part of the software crafters movement. It's just kind of part of this subculture we're in software development, and how much I appreciate a lot of these things. And as someone who what's the word I'm looking for? As someone who currently mentors several people who's running kind of a team, it made me realize, oh, this is now required reading to some degree, at least required reference material, because I articulate a lot of these points, and at this point, I've kind of gotten that assumed knowledge. I just know, oh yeah, that's just the way you do things. I was like, oh right, I don't know if this was the first time I heard this point, but I definitely remember reading it here, so for that, it was a positive experience as I kind of refreshed myself through the pages. Cool. So let's just dive right into it, and let's talk about right in the beginning there in chapter 1, talking about your knowledge portfolio. This is something I have kind of taken with me from the first time I've read it, and something I definitely spoke about a lot when I was teaching at a code school. And I'm curious, Ariel, what your thoughts are on it, and if this concept kind of rings true for your experience.
So I guess I'll start by saying that we are a club that's all about building our knowledge portfolio, a very particular brand of knowledge, and maybe less in the technical direction, more in the direction of all the people stuff associated with technology. But It would be very hard, coming from that position to say, well, really you shouldn't build your knowledge portfolio. I think we all understand that it's worth, the time and the investment. What was very interesting to me about that whole section was it was speaking about it like an investment, right? It was saying, invest in your most precious resource, which is yourself. And I found myself, kind of going back and forth between like, oh, this is such a great idea, and oh wow, this is such a terrible idea. Because there are certain elements of, it's good to stay up to date with like the latest technologies to some degree. At the same time, diversify, right? So be aware of, of goings on in your industry so that it's not totally new to you when you when you want to update, your skills for, for the job market or things like that. But you also want to be, more an expert in the frameworks and languages that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. A lot of it made sense, but there's also questions of like, is that realistic to expect from people? People have lives. I mean, like, I've never heard, Andy Hunt speak, but I certainly have heard Dave Thomas speak. And that is a person who lives and breathes code, and that's fine. And that's great for him. But not everybody who codes is going to be that, and not everyone who codes should be that. There's a lot of ways to develop yourself as just even a general good human being that will help you a lot in your career, having nothing to do with technical skills. And so the idea of learn a new language every year was one of the suggestions. I definitely don't do that, except maybe by accident. Like recently I went to a meetup about Reason ML. So I'm like, cool, why don't I play around with that in the console for a bit? If that counts as learning a new language, then great. But that's not something that I'm going to invest time in, because it's not something that's going to be immediately relevant. I do try to stay aware of, interesting things that are happening. I try to follow up on, Elixir and Rust and a few different things that are out there that are interesting, intriguing, that might help me to expand the way that I think about code. But that's a very far cry from actually sitting down and investing hours and days in learning, a whole new language, maybe a whole new skill set. It's just, I think, not realistic for most people if they want to have lives outside of work. And I think that we really do want to encourage people to have lives outside of work, especially when you think about all the horrible things that have happened over the last few years, all the stories that are coming out of different tech companies where programmers just like do terrible things or at the very least highly questionable things that don't jive with reality. And you sort of imagine that like, well, if they're kind of being encouraged to do nothing but live, eat, and breathe code, maybe they lose a little bit of the sense of what goes on in the outside world and in real people's lives. They're not forming those connections, and then they build features that are not necessarily intentionally hostile, but may cause a lot of harm or a lot of pain to people. So I just question how much it's worth emphasizing this point of building your knowledge portfolio. I think practically it's a good idea, and I certainly wouldn't tell someone, especially a new programmer, I would not advise them, not to learn new stuff. I think the job market demands it, and I would not be doing them any favors if I told them, oh, don't bother with it. But I think as an industry, it would be a lot better if we encourage people to really live great lives outside of the code that you're writing, outside of your technical stuff. And like if part of that great life that you're living is I'm doing open source work, or I'm mentoring in a code context, that's great. But that's very different than I should be spending all of my time building technical skills.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say I agree with that, and it makes me glad we chose this as a book to talk about, because it helps us kind of square a lot of what we talk about on previous books that are really in the realm of like communication or interpersonal relationships. And this is like, this is code perspective. So let's wrap back in everything we've learned from the other books to apply to this. I remember really taking to heart the knowledge portfolio stuff when I first read this, and more now than I used to. I feel like I don't care for the finance analogy at all. Maybe it's because I'm a little burned on financial markets in general, but I have that pull, kind of like you were expressing there. There's a little bit of a tension, because I have kind of dictated my own career based on the general idea. Not I never took any of these advice to heart. I mean, I do at this point. I know a dozen languages, but that's because I enjoy learning a new language. Like like I don't do this very often, but I cherish the Friday nights when I can like get a cup of tea and sit on a chair with a laptop and learn a new language. Like that's a really exciting thing for me. I don't do it as a career investment. And as a person who has a team of employees, I don't expect them to go spend their Fridays learning new languages. And that would be absurd of me to expect that, even though I expect them to grow as programmers and to be good programmers. I think it's not worth going into justifications for why or why not, this is built the way it is. So I think there are some good takeaways that just need bumpers. They need caveats. It needs to be, hey, if you're looking at how to have the best career as a software programmer, and you want to be the pragmatic programmer throughout your life, don't have tunnel vision about Java. Like don't be PHP is my life and that's all I'll do forever. But that being said, that does work for a lot of people. Like a lot of people can do PHP for their entire career. But what it's trying to say here is you will grow as a programmer if you try different things, if you dabble here, dabble there, but still have your core. It reminds me of the idea of a T-shaped programmer, right? That whole idea of you should be really deeply skilled in one area, but then shallow in a few other areas. And that was something I would, tell students as they kind of were to go off is like, don't spread yourself too thin. Don't learn everything, even though it's tempting. Focus on one thing, but kind of pick up new things as they interest you. And I really think the focus needs to be to kind of like better our industry. The focus needs to be more on how can you improve yourself as a developer while also maintaining yourself as a human? Kind of like what you said. I think people need to have a holistic view of software and code. I don't think everything you learn should be another language in your tool belt. You should actually diversify your knowledge portfolio to not just be software knowledge, but to be general world knowledge. And, the best people I've ever worked on consulting teams have always been people who have diverse backgrounds of knowledge outside of just coding. They're a designer, but they, worked in real estate for 20 years, or they're a programmer who loves physics and they can bring that into whatever we're discussing. And it seems like it won't come up, but it always actually does over the course of a project. So if we could just like take it and then tweak it a little bit, I think that's the direction I would kind of push it into.
And so I just want to throw out, while you were, saying that, and I absolutely agree with what you said. And I also have to say, like, I'm really happy that there is at least now clearly one boss out there who, who is not going to impose these kind of unreasonable, demands or expectations on their workers. So good for you. So I kind of jumped back and looked real quick back at one or two things in the book, and I do have to give it some credit. It does say read non-technical books too. My concern is it kind of ends up being more of a footnote than a main thrust. But it's not like they're saying ignore the human element. And in fact, there are certain. I think literally the next section of the book is about communication skills. So there's that. The other thing is, the world has changed somewhat. This book was written in 1999 or maybe 2000. I don't know. It was like there are two dates in the copyright page. I think 2000 actually. I'm thinking back to 2000. Like that's like .com bubble time. That's time when things were we're looking up for the programming community, but at the same time, it was not what it is today. The web was still in its early stages. You didn't have like, I don't even know how many millions of pages built in WordPress, right? Today, you can be a WordPress developer and that's all you know, and you can make good money, and that can last you for quite a while. And all you really know is, some PHP and WordPress, and you're familiar with plugins, and, and you can build stuff, and that's great. It kind of mirrors the trend in academia over time, where once upon a time, like to be an academic, you had to kind of know everything. And over time, it just became there was just too much to know. And so people began specializing more and more. And now you have like very, very, very narrow subfields that there are, just a handful of people around the world who know everything there is to know about it. But they're not as broad. And I think that's what's probably happening with software over time, is that as each individual community expands, as the number of roles and jobs that you can take on with a particular tool set is going to expand, the less of a need there is to diversify. It doesn't mean that you won't gain something from trying out other styles of programming. I think there's a really good blog post by Avdi Grimm about this, where he speaks about, here are the languages that I want to learn, and here are the languages that I don't care about learning. And it's not like Avdi Grimm is going to, abandon Ruby tomorrow. He's built a career on teaching Ruby, and he's going to keep doing it. But he said that there are certain languages that will teach me new ways of thinking that I can then bring back and apply in the language that I'm coming from. So from that perspective, yes, it's good to learn other languages, and it will make you a better programmer. But it's not as essential to like surviving in your career as it once was, I would say.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I definitely think it's important to acknowledge the time this is written in, because things have gone through a few cycles since then, as far as like technology we use, the way we design software. A lot of stuff has changed, and I think it is worth thinking about like what was the perspective of the intended reader, like what kind of company they're working at. And just to touch on your point, I have just felt it in my own career where I became a developer wanting to be a quote unquote full stack developer. And even this day, that sounds like most people look at you like, what does that mean? Like there was a time when that meant something and people kind of nodded, but now it's like, you can't actually be full stack. You need to know from Kubernetes to BEM. Like you need to know SaaS style frameworks, and you need to know deployment architecture, and that's full stack. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm a little rough on the edges. What that used to mean was I know a backend language and I know JavaScript. And like between those two, I can write a full app. And that is even becoming less relevant as most companies hire a front-end team and they hire a back-end team. And those teams get really good at the things they know, and then they integrate at some level. So yeah, I think that's just something we need to keep in mind as people in our career, as we progress and as we recommend books and other reading for people in the future. It's like, well, think about where the industry is now and what that means. What does diversifying mean in whatever thing you're into? But I'm always the type of person, my personal mantra philosophy is, an always be learning type of approach. And sometimes that does mean learning something far afield, because you never know what you might just fall in love with. For me, like I really fell in love with functional programming after first thinking it was like a really stupid, hyped up thing with no point to it. And then came back later and being like, no, actually, I like this. I like this a lot. And this is all I want to do from now on. That being said, I write Ruby and JavaScript all the time still. So, your things you like might not necessarily map one-to-one to the career choices you make, but you can still have a personal edification and a personal, success based on that. All right, we are really off to the races, and we're only in half part of chapter 1. So we'll keep moving. But staying on chapter 1 for a little bit longer, the book talks about communication skills and talks about how we relate to people we work with. And Ariel, I know you had some thoughts on this, and I want to give you a chance to kind of talk about how you felt about this right off the bat, especially since we've done so much on communication here.
Yeah, so it was interesting. It was taking a very different approach than what we've seen in the past. What we've seen in the past is usually about kind of the subtler elements, the things that go on before the conversation, what's going on in your head, what's going on in their head, feelings, things like that. And this was really more about, okay, you already, this is going to be not a difficult conversation, not an emotional conversation. That can happen too, but most of our communication is not that. And when you're just dealing with, day-to-day business communication, there are ways of doing it well, and there are ways of doing it that are going to be less effective. So just kind of a few points that I thought were really worth mentioning and remembering. The first thing is know what you want to say. This is very difficult for me personally. Usually I'll, research, investigate a topic, and what I'll come away with is I did a lot of research. I won't necessarily come back with, and here's what we should do with it. I tend to err on the side of let's just present all the data and let people make their own calls and have their own thoughts before we make a joint decision. But if you're the one who did the research, you actually have a really good opportunity there to push in the direction of a certain conclusion. And if you don't take advantage of that, very often you're going to be frustrated by the outcomes, especially since you've done all the research and you think you know better, because you kind of do. You may not know all the factors, but at least you've done a lot of work in advance to to figure stuff out. Or if it's something that a request that you're making of someone else, also again, just knowing what you want to say, people appreciate that. And that really goes hand in hand with another point, which is knowing your audience. Some people are interested in in details and diving deep, and some people are really interested in just like, tell me the bottom line and let's move on. And so this was it's interesting for me, literally right now. So I just started to work at a new job last week, which is very exciting. Up until now, I've been working for a U.S. company, and now I'm working day to day with Israelis. And Israelis have a very different, what's the word? A very different approach to communication. There's a lot of impatience, I would say, coming from an American perspective. Basically, it's like, get to the bottom line, tell me what you want to tell me, and then let's move on to something else. So the things that have worked for me in the past in a different cultural context, I need to modify a lot of that. Knowing what you want to say becomes much more important, because they are interested in hearing what you want to say. They just want you to get to the point, quickly. And that's not necessarily true for other kinds of audiences. So that's something I'm kind of struggling with right now, getting ready for my first presentation in front of an audience and figuring out how I'm going to do it in a way that is going to, to appeal to people coming from that culture as opposed to the culture that I grew up with. Then there's choose your moment, which is about basically don't bring up like a really important issue, as your boss is like gathering their things on a Friday about to walk out the door. That is not the time to bring up, an important issue. It's, figure out what's the time where people are going to respond as favorably as possible to what you want to discuss with them. Same thing, like if you want to schedule a meeting that may run overtime, like don't schedule it for the end of the day. If you want to, the beginning of the day also might not be the best time. During lunchtime may annoy people. I mean, there's a lot of calculations that you have to do to figure out what's really the best time to communicate with people. And it also, again, overlaps somewhat with knowing your audience. There's the idea of make it look good, which this is something that I personally take a lot of pride in. This one I more or less have figured out, but basically if you're going to present something, like put in a little bit of extra time to make it beautiful. It's like when you send a resume to potential employer. If you don't put in the time to make your resume look good, even though it doesn't say a whole lot about your experience or your ability to do the job, people still care about it. So whether you like it or not, they're going to be judging you based on how your resume looks, unless they, put it through some kind of like HR tool that like gobbles it up and turns it into keywords and then, rejects you immediately. But generally speaking, people will look at those details, and that's just as true in day-to-day communication. Writing, and this is very, very hard, by the way, for people who are not native English speakers and have to communicate in English. So I want to just kind of point out the opposite side of that, which is sometimes people won't make it look good. Figure out when you are kind of falling prey to that bias and you're paying attention to the presentation rather than the content. So that was something that kind of popped out at me. And the last thing is listen. A lot of people really just, they won't. This is something that we actually spoke about in difficult conversations, right? The idea that sometimes people have to be heard before they can listen. And so if you want to convey a message to somebody, sometimes you have to hear them, speak their piece before you're able to speak yours and have them appreciate it. And even if you've already said your piece and they heard it, but people still really appreciate having their side listened to as well. And in the long term, that's going to pay off significant dividends in terms of that relationship. So those are kind of the scattered, but I think really all significant points in terms of the section on communication skills. And it did make me very happy that this book, which is it is ultimately about a lot of technical things with some other stuff interspersed, but the fact that it had a pretty strong communication skills section did make me very happy.
Yeah, I was happy to see that too, and I was happy to see not only things that we've talked about before and really enjoyed, but also just a different way of framing it. We always talk about with some of the other books, like, okay, well, how do we make a practical version of this? How do we apply these more abstract theoretical communication styles? These felt more practical, especially for like the day-to-day job, because that's kind of what this was for. And I could go over examples of all the time someone's gotten all of those wrong, all of those different points. It's not worth going into
like
those.
different situations where individuals got one of them wrong, or situations where someone got all of them together wrong, or maybe both.
Both, but as you were talking, every time you'd mention one bit, like, okay, know your audience. I'm like, oh yeah, I know when someone messed that one up. And that one in particular, I think, comes up a lot with programmers. So again, for any new listeners, I do primarily web consulting. We have meetings with clients all the time to talk about what's going on with them. I can't count the amount of times I've done that with a developer on my team or a developer on their team. Will just go off and start talking about some feature in like minute detail about like how this plugin integrates with the architecture, and the clients, the project managers, are just kind of like, first of all, wondering why this conversation is happening at all. But second of all, like waiting for it to end, because they're like, okay, can we get back to the reason we're having this meeting? We're not here to talk about, this feature. But some developers really feel like, to talk about something they're building, they have to go into that amount of detail. And it really goes back to us about knowing your audience. You have to know, like, is this the right group to go into that much detail? And that is nuance. I think that takes practice, I think, to really know enough, have enough self-awareness to know what should be said. And the making it look good is just really true to my heart. Having a background pre-tech of like doing presentations and like, putting on shows. And I always just feel like every time you're doing a presentation, like it matters to go the extra 10%. Like sweating the details is so important. Internal meetings, slideshows at conferences, anytime you are in a situation where you are where you have to present something to other people, take the time to make it look good. It will reflect better on you, and you'll catch more things. You'll feel more prepared. It's just like the materials you present are also communication. Like that is what's really nice. This is kind of in the same section. Is like the things you are giving to people, those also count. So really take time to consider those.
One example that I'll just throw out there in terms of sweating the extra details is, and this really depends on culture, whether it's general culture like of where you live or workplace culture, but you can think about the example and come up with things that are more or less equivalent for whatever context you're in. I like to add animated GIFs to everything. To internal presentations, that doesn't matter if I'm giving a presentation in front of 3 people, but adding little jokes, funny things, things that'll keep the audience awake. It's kind of my way of saying, hey, I know that you're sitting in a presentation. Sitting in a presentation is often a painful thing, and and I'm trying to make this as as least an unpleasant experience as possible. Giving you a little bit of a chance to take a breather from the droning of me, the speaker, just to kind of share a little laugh. I think those kind of things, also just showing empathy with your audience, can go a long way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that curtails right back into knowing your audience. Like, know which gifts are appropriate for the audience and also know the presentation manner. I was at a conference this year where someone was having gifts on like a 20-foot by 30-foot screen. And all of a sudden, like, oh, those are really hard to watch when they're, stuttering at 15 frames a second, 20 feet across. So might need some a dry run on depending on how big the screen is. Yeah. So another point that you had brought up, Ariel, was this idea of getting back to people, letting them know when you're going to get back to them, how you're going to communicate with them. And you mentioned a point about that affecting the way you think about email. I'd love you to kind of flesh that out, because I guarantee it's going to be something I'm going to say I could get better at myself.
Yeah, it's not actually about getting back to people more quickly. It's about being more honest with people about when you're going to get back to them. So essentially, like, email is a sort of weird system. You think about it like, in an event-driven way, it's like I send an event in your direction, and then I'm just like kind of hanging, waiting for the request to complete. And and that event may get sent back in the opposite direction or not, and I don't know. And then there's like a time at some point where I just get really frustrated and give up. That's not a pleasant experience really for any of the parties. And so one of the things they recommend is, if you can't answer a person right away, that's fine, but tell them, I don't have enough information to answer this right now, or I will have enough information in a week, so I'll get back to you then, and if I don't, you can bug me about it. But giving people a sense of, here was my reaction when I received that that message, that's really important and valuable. Of course, as I'm saying this, it occurs to me like, wow, that's like an idea that could really apply to, evented systems or, microservices, like in a very technical way. But that's not really what this, this discussion is about. But in general, like it's changed. Like I know that I've historically created a lot of frustration for other people by not responding to emails at all. And, I also have experienced a lot of frustration when I send emails to people and I'm like, okay, do I send another one? Do I keep waiting? Has it been long enough to like just send a new one and be like, hey, I don't know if you saw my previous email. Like, of course they saw it and they just, archived it or whatever. Like, anytime you say like, did you get that thing I sent you? Of course they did. The point is they probably ignored it. It's just like general rule for life. But yeah, I realized like that's something I would have really appreciated, is if I sent someone a message and they say, yes, I will get back to you by such and such date. And if not, then you can bug me by then. And so I've started to try to do that for other people, because I think it respects their feelings a lot more, and it's a very small gesture, but something that can mean a lot to other people.
No, yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's good. It did make me think about how my own approach to email. I'm pretty good at email with my current position. I get a lot of email, so I'm always kind of I take like once or twice a day. But there are still situations, especially with personal emails, or like someone emails me asking for advice in their career, or they want some help with like a resume that we look over. And I'm like, yeah, this is important. And then I just let it sit for a week because it's important. So I want to make sure I devote time to it. And then it keeps getting pushed off. And then person emails me back. They're like, are you still available? I'm like, yes, I promise. I promise I'm still available. And then it gets pushed back again. I do like this idea of being more forthcoming with when things will be delayed, what your availability is, so people aren't left waiting for you. I don't do it as often as I should, but I do like the idea of replying right away with, hey, like, copy, I got your email, and I will process it at this interval, whatever my current load allows me to do. Because sometimes the amount of stuff available on our platforms can be overwhelming, with like between Slack and email and everything else, you can get kind of in the weeds. But speaking of like human and Slack and communication, there's this idea of decoupling human systems. Ariel, would you like to touch on that?
Yeah, it's still something a little bit vague, but there was a lot of talk in the book about coupled code systems in all their various forms, and it kind of it kind of got me thinking about how, well, there's Conway's law, right, which basically says that your code is going to reflect the design of your code is going to reflect the architecture of your people, and if there's a lot of coupled stuff, maybe it can sometimes point to coupled human systems. So, that sort of opens up this direction of thinking about what is a coupled human system. Where do we find those happening in our in our workplaces? One kind of very obvious example, right? So in the book it spoke about systems that are coupled in time, right? They're like, it has to be, A, then B, then C, then D. So D depends on A, B, and C depends on A and B depends on A, right? If you can figure out how to not have all those things depend on each other, you can make you can have significant performance improvements because now you can have different streams being processed separately in different places. We definitely have human systems that are like that, especially if you think about like the classic, waterfall approach of, stuff starts in, I don't know, whoever is coming up with ideas in the organization, and then it goes down to to product people, and it gets the specs, and then it goes to the developers, and then it goes to the QA testers, and then the release manager, and it's like this sort of long chain where there's no way of parallelizing any of it. And there are cases where that's important, where it makes sense. But when you can avoid having those temporally coupled systems, you can actually move a lot more quickly and get a lot more done and get the right work done as well. But that's kind of the most obvious thing, just because we talk about it so much in the programming community. But there's other things. So let's say you have an API and a UI that are being developed very much in tandem. Very often what that means is like those two systems. I mean, obviously, if there's the change to the API, if there's a breaking change, that's just going to break the UI, which means that now these two systems of people have to make sure they're communicating with each other and synchronizing any changes that they're making. And how do you do that? Well, maybe we'll just have everything live in a monorepo. Well, now these systems are even more coupled, right? Are there ways of establishing contracts between the two sides? Maybe having having systems where the API is add only, conventions, things that allow you to move forward on one system without blocking the other. There's also the idea of orthogonality, which applies both to code and to human systems, where you have basically two systems that can move without affecting each other. And anytime you can accomplish that, that's a big win, because now you can make changes to those two systems independently and they won't break each other. So not necessarily the most organized thoughts, but there's definitely what to think about there in terms of, where do we have systems of people that are coupled to each other, that are very often, again, temporally dependent on each other, but maybe not. Maybe it's just the products that we're working on will break if we change too many things about them without having very, very strong communication patterns. And traditionally, we try to solve that by having stronger communication. But there is also the option of figuring out how to make changes in the two systems just not break each other. So the decoupling idea.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with a lot of that. And I like the idea of the thought exercise of decoupling human systems, because in my experience, having done some consulting on the more business side of things, not just the code side of things, a lot of businesses don't, unless they have someone in this role, don't always look internally to like how could they fix their system. A lot of systems, apart from what's been outlined by like a project manager or like a operations officer, tended to kind of be ad hoc. Well, it's like, well, we've developed the system because we need QA to see it, we need biz dev to see it, and we need developers to make it. So it kind of just looks like this, and then they don't really. that's just kind of the shrug. It's like it looks like this, or you end up on the other side of the ladder, which is, a Jira board with 82 swim lanes and 15 columns. One of the projects I work on, the Jira board not only have it, I think it has 25 different states a card can be in. And developers only have to worry about 10 of those, so that's nice. But it's going to keep it goes to a lot more states before it gets to us, and it goes to a lot of states after we leave it. And there's probably some reason behind all of those, but I would venture to guess that could be streamlined if the business needed it, or if the team needed it. If we kept finding, handoff issues, or having, this issue of coupling, like, oh, I can't do this because of them, or they can't do this because of me. Well, maybe we need to look at this process and see like which of these things could be simultaneously. And sometimes that does involve looking at the how the code is done, and then looking at old Conway's law and be like, okay, well, maybe we should restructure our teams. Maybe, and that's the thing that can actually really help. Well, if we structure our teams in a different way, we know we're going to end up with a different system, a different code way of looking at things. Maybe that's the way we need to approach them. It's a great thought exercise, at the least.
I like that you mentioned, structuring our teams differently, and it does kind of point towards one of the solutions that's out there, which is the idea of the cross-functional team. So like you said before, people, places tend to hire like the front end team, the back end team, and then the challenge of communication. I mean, I worked in one place where I had a coworker who would just like constantly tell me like the biggest problems that we have are because we have a front end team and we have a back end team, and we should have just had small cross-functional teams that involve front end and back end and ops and just all in one place, but small groups working on a small vertical, right? And that's kind of the issue, is that you have these like horizontal layers, a stratification of teams that causes a lot of problems, because you have large groups of people who are dependent on each other, right? So if you think about it, what's like the big problem with God objects in your system, right? God classes. It's that there's like so much that depends on so much, and it's just too much to reason about, and stuff breaks all the time. If you have like very small objects, even if they're very tightly coupled, but they're still small. And that's kind of the idea of a cross-functional team, is that you have a small number of people who are tightly coupled to each other. We say, yeah, okay, so we are going to be tightly coupled because that's kind of the nature of the beast when you have a multi-layered system. But if we can split it into different verticals, where everyone from ops all the way down to the client side is working together, but in a very, very small group, working on on a per feature basis, or maybe they just own different elements of the system or whatever it is. That's a way of saying, yeah, we're going to have that coupling, but we're going to minimize the number of people who have to be coupled in order for this to all work. And that can be a really great help in handling the challenges of tightly coupled systems. At least the systems are smaller.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that. My favorite teams have always been lean teams of just a few people that have different backgrounds and different tech skills, and we just iterate as fast as we can. So moving on to chapter a little bit further on in chapter 2, talk about the idea of tracer bullets and prototypes, and this idea of figuring out the part of the system that you're likely to throw out. Kind of makes me think a little bit of the idea of spikes when you're preparing to do a new sprint or approach a new epic. And I love spikes. I'm always a fan. I actually said this on a call today. I'm like, if we're ever in a situation where we're debating whether or not we need a spike, I just always vote we should do it. Because more knowledge is better, helps us be more informed on what we're going to do. But Ariel, what are your thoughts on this part of the book?
So I think the first thing that's important, the author spent a lot of time just explaining the difference between these two ideas, right? Prototypes and tracer bullets. So tracer bullets are based on a combat technique, right, where you send this bullet that basically has a light on it, and the goal of the bullet is not to hit anything, but just to kind of light the way for all the other bullets. So it's basically building a bridge between where you are and where you want to be. That's not fully built out. It's not accomplishing the task, but it's just showing you the entire path. So the idea of a tracer bullet is you build a complete cross section of a system, right? It's not particularly good or useful, but it bridges the entire span of the system, but it's just a very, very small slice of it. And those are things that you usually build in order to lay the foundation for the rest of your system. Contrast that with prototypes, which are very shoddily built versions of a whole system, and you build them very quickly, and then you probably throw them out because they are not very well built, and you want to use better techniques, but you're building them just to understand the system, right? So they have very different goals, right? Prototypes are just basically for learning. Tracer bullets are for, I don't know how to build this system, but I want something that is in my hand that works, that I can build upon, and so it's laying a foundation. And they're both useful, and it's not like one is the right answer versus the other. They both have their appropriate applications. And I mean, I've definitely done both. Built a prototype just to throw it out, but just to like try out a technology, see if it could be a good fit for for a particular problem. Tracer bullets, like let's say I know I have to connect with a certain service, and we're going to have to talk to these 12 different endpoints, and okay, so let's just talk to one endpoint. I know that like my API key works, and I know that and I can already start looking at the performance elements of this particular system that we have to talk to. There are some things that you can learn that way that you wouldn't necessarily learn through a prototype, or that even a prototype would be too expensive to build. But the tracer bullet lays that foundation, lets you build kind of the glue code in a way. It's sort of interesting in that it's very similar to a different project that I did, where I wanted to build a client for a JSON API, a JSON API. I hate that standard has that name, by the way. Naming things is hard.
Naming things is hard.
Yeah. So what I ended up doing was I kind of built it in layers, and one layer was just something that understands JSON API, and there was another layer on top of that that understood this particular API. And I didn't have to build a whole lot of stuff specific to this API to get to that first layer. And once I had that layer, it sort of helped me build out the rest of the client very, very quickly. So, so tracer bullets can be good for that, for sort of figuring out like what are the steps, what are the layers that I'm going to need to build in order to make this an easier project to carry through. And if you're not focused on like, okay, I have to just like get all the functionality built like right away. I just want a thing that works. And then I'm just going to fill in the details later. That can help you think in a very different way about what are the right abstractions to create that will make your life easier down the road.
Yep. I love it. I love prototyping. I love spikes. And actually the tracer bullet thing is interesting because this is another thing that I feel I've done, but lost the beginning of it. Like, I don't think I've ever used the word tracer bullet in ever, other than maybe referencing a World War II movie or something, right? But like,
you're right. It's not a very common term.
No, it's not. But the concept of, I would just call it like building a vertical slice, which is what it is. Like the concept of building features out from end to end, even though the rest of the system isn't there, is how I've built software like my entire career. Okay, if I'm building something for a client, I am not going to say, okay, well, we got the database done. Now we're going to work on the model layer. I'll see you in 3 more weeks when we finish that, and then we'll talk about the controllers. Like, we're not going to just build like a cake up to the top. I'm going to say, great, so if you go to the staging site we pulled up for you, you can see there's all the user posts. There's no authentication, there's no email, there's no comments, but there's user posts working with JavaScript, and CSS, and HTML, like all the way down. And I've also found this approach really helpful when you're working on a team of multiple skill levels. Like, if I'm working with junior developers and mid-level developers, and I'm trying to, as the senior on the project, provide a pattern or a template for how the system should be built, it is not beneficial for me to carve off a chunk of the app and to say, well, I'm going to work on the reporting because that's really complicated, and you all keep working, and then because I can't expect them to look at the reporting, like assume that methodology, and then kind of replicate it, because it's going to be different everywhere in the application. But one thing I found very useful is for me to, working in tandem with the team, not to do like drive-by coding, but working with them, do a vertical slice. Like, I will come in and be like, okay, well, this is how I would wire up the front-end API to this back-end we're working on, and this is how I would wire up that to a third-party service, and this is how I'm going to do my validations, and this is how I'm going to structure and abstract everything out. And then that gives them a pattern of replication. They can say, oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense. They can go back to that tracer bullet right through the middle of the application and say, how was this approach here? How was this approach there? And that can be followed up with 2 or 3 more of those in different areas. And that provides a system that everyone can kind of start to fill in as they go. Like, I like the idea. You kind of nailed it on the head there when you said it kind of exposes future abstractions for you when you do that, because it's kind of giving you that chance of biting off a small bit of everything.
I think there's also one more important point, just building on what you're saying, and what I was saying as well. Sandy Metz, I've heard speak a number of times about the danger of choosing the wrong abstraction. That, in other words, having no abstraction at all is still cheaper than choosing the wrong abstraction. And one of the nice, it's like, there's this problem that we kind of have when you try to build like too much of a layer at a time, is that you immediately jump to build these abstractions. When you are just building a small vertical slice, it's just not worth it to build something that's going to abstract something that you're going to do at any given layer a whole bunch of times, but doesn't really translate across layers. So what she usually suggests is wait until you have 2, but ideally 3 times that you've built something, and maybe you've done some copy pasting, whatever it is. But now at least you really have some solid evidence as to here are going to be the generally applicable needs of this abstraction layer. And I think the really beautiful thing about tracer bullets is that they force you to build at least your first example without building those abstractions, because at that point it's just not worth it, because you're only building one, and it's much easier to say like, okay, I'm going to put off building those abstractions. I'm going to push off making choices that are going to be difficult to reverse. Right. Again, also a thing in Pragmatic Programmer, right? The reversibility of decisions is really important. So when decisions are not easily reversible, when it's costly to reverse that decision, we're just going to put it off because it's not worth making that decision right now. I think it's also just important to point out, again, because this is DEBC book club. It's not just it's not just like code design and architecture book club. There are very powerful psychological elements to prototypes and tracer bullets. Prototypes are really good, even if you throw it out and you don't actually go in the direction that you were trying out with this prototype. They're really good to it's good to get in the habit of building prototypes all the time as part of developing a culture of learning. And tracer bullets have a different property that's really interesting, where there's something really exciting about we did a complete system that is very, very narrow. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it's complete and it does something. If you spend months and months building layers from the bottom to the top, or top to bottom, whichever way you think about it, it's a long, long time until you have something that actually works. And that can be really, really difficult on an individual or on a team. When you have something from the beginning that works, and then you're just building, you're building sideways more and more things that work. And every few days you're putting out a new feature that's working already, more or less. That's just much healthier psychologically for the team than having like the entire success pushed off right to the end. You can't always do it, but whenever you can, it's a much healthier way to develop software, just from the perspective of burnout, frankly.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's different, but it's the same microcosm, the same general idea of small iterations. Like I know you're not talking about like building the whole system, but like it's very important to still have those wins, have something visible, have something that we have some proof to it. Yeah, the last thing you want is to have an entire team going full speed to it might work one day. I don't know. You really want to get some proof of concept earlier than later, and then build out from there. I found pretty helpful.
I think that as a software agency, you have a certain advantage in that you have to be constantly presenting to clients. Like you need something to show for your efforts. And I know that can be really frustrating and can be difficult sometimes. Mm-hmm. But you have a very powerful motivation to get something working right away. It is much harder to develop that culture when you're in an organization that is not presenting to external stakeholders. And like one of the things that I've seen be really, really valuable is to just have that same thing. Even if you're in that kind of organization, have some kind of regular, whether it's a sprint retro or whether it's just some kind of out of band meeting that's just regular, that maybe even, with higher level people in the company, but something where you're constantly presenting the things that you're working on. And you have that motivation, like, okay, we have to have something to show for our efforts. Let's make sure that we're building complete systems as we go.
Yeah, completely agreed. So moving on a little bit to chapter 3, we have this idea of tools of the trade, which reminds me of the adage that I've had a very complicated history with, which is the true craftsman never blames his tools. And we can go into why I do and don't like that for various reasons. But this chapter is talking about like, hey, we use things as programmers, right? We should know them. We should get really good at them. But there might be a limit to that. And I'd love to know what Ariel's thoughts are on this particular chapter.
I'd like to hear your thoughts too, by the way.
Oh, they're coming. Don't worry.
All right, cool. So, I'm kind of taken back to my first day as a bootcamp student, where I basically sat down at a table with 3 other people, And the guy I was sitting next to was like doing all kinds of magical wizardry in his terminal, because apparently he spent like the first few weeks or the last few weeks before the boot camp, learning Bash, learning a little bit of Vim, just getting like really good at the tools basically. And then like we actually opened the text editor and there was something that we had to write. And I had spent that same time learning code. And it turns out that however fast you can move, however fancy your terminal setup is, and however quick you are to type Vim commands, you have to have something to type. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly whose preparation had paid off. And I don't say this to gloat. I say this because I think there is this kind of machismo around, like, okay, look at me. I can do all kinds of magic in the tools themselves. And I think that there's value in it if it makes your life easier. But even if you know only a small percentage of how your tools work, that's actually more than good enough for most daily tasks. If you think saving a few keystrokes is going to have a massive impact on your productivity, you're pretty clearly, I don't want to know what kind of code you're writing, basically. I'm not going to say that it's not valuable. There's a book about Vim called like Edit Text at the Speed of Thought. And I think there's something really cool about that idea, right? That if you get it good enough with your tools, that they basically just become an expression that there's like zero friction between your mind and what's going on your screen. And I think reaching that level could be really, really valuable. I certainly don't want to discourage people from going that direction and learning the tools. But to suggest that somebody is like missing something as a programmer if they don't find that to be an important path of study and investigation, that just strikes me as a bit much. I think it's something that can be valuable. If you find it valuable, then great. But it's not the main thing that we do, right? We're ultimately building products for people, and how we get there and how quickly we can type and all that is really just details. And the details that may make your life a lot easier and your development process a lot smoother, but that's for you as a programmer. It's not for the job that you're doing. And we shouldn't judge programmers based on that.
Yep. I can't disagree with any of that. What I will say is, I think most, I want to use the right phrase here, like, I don't want to call them life hacks, but like productivity hacks, right? Like anything that's like how to like trick out your terminal in 32 commands, are distractions, right? Like ultimately that's what they are. They're just distractions, and that's okay. Distractions are allowed to exist. You're allowed to have little pleasantries in your career and in your life. We're not all working on gray IBM desktops that all look identical with the exact same, wallpaper and the exact same terminal font. Like we can. I think there is what's the one I'm looking for? Value in investing in your tools. And I actually wrote a blog post like 12 years ago called "Investing in Your Tools," as a concept of like, go back to like an artisan example. Like a lot of artisans have custom tools. So they have tools like this is, even if it's not practical, they have the one hammer that has like all of the filigree on it that's like custom engraved, right? I like to think of my terminal as a reflection of my work style, the things I enjoy, but I'm thinking more about aesthetics. I'm thinking about like the color and everything else. But I think that can extend to things like shortcuts and things like using Vim. So I'm an avid Vim user, but I learned it because I felt like I had to, right? Like there was that impression upon me early in my career that quote unquote good developers learn Vim and good developers are fast. But what you really realize is exactly what you said, is we program much slower than we can type, right? Like programming is mostly reading. I remember watching a talk where this person was explaining that they like recorded all of their sessions just for a week. They were curious. They recorded every time they programmed, and they went back through and they took a graph of how much time they were typing and how much time they were reading. And it was like 6-to-1. It was like almost the entire day is reading code, not writing code. So there really isn't that much benefit in being like the fastest at doing something. But the caveat to that one is what you touched on the end there, that being able to transfer seamlessly from thought to action is a not transcendent experience, but it is definitely something that if you've never experienced it, can just make your job feel more fluid, makes you feel like, okay, I know what I'm doing, done, move on, especially like in a TDD cycle, the idea that I can just press one key and my tests run instantly in the same browser window or the same terminal window, I see, enter, done, move on, is a much nicer experience at keeping me focused on the job and moving forward. But I agree, there is an issue, which like micro optimizations, like micro refactoring, it's like the low hanging fruit. It's very easy to think I'm getting better because I'm getting faster at coding. And by getting faster at coding, I learn a few more Vim tricks, But there is diminishing returns, I think, very quickly from that. And I think as a developer, have to be cognizant of that it is a distraction and you're investing in it because you want to, not because it's actually providing you any real meaningful benefit other than like that first level. Like with me and Vim is, I've been doing Vim for 7-8 years. About that, I don't Vim like I've been doing it for 8 years. I kind of capped after a year. I'm like, cool, I learned those things, and I haven't really learned much since then. Beyond that, saving a few keystrokes here and there is helpful for my RSI issues, not having to strain as much. But other than that, I type sufficiently fast for the work I need to do. And it is fun when I'm under a deadline and I can reformat an entire file in 15 keystrokes and like, ta-da, look at that magic I did. But that's not my job. My job isn't to perform magic tricks. My job is to deliver value. Yeah, so I think we're both in this middle ground with this, which is there is a value, but you need to not focus on it at the cost of other things. And definitely don't act because you're faster or act like other people are better developers because they're faster, because I've seen some amazing developers in my time with black text on a white terminal background with no syntax highlighting, with no hotkeys, and they're just cranking out code. I'm just like, I mind's blown every time I see that.
One thing I would say that is valuable about that section is, and I would agree with, is it's true that the tools are not the most important thing, but it is important to have to kind of get over the fear of the tools. This happens a lot with Bash scripting, certainly. There's a beautiful talk by Gary Bernhardt, just all about this idea of don't be afraid of the command line. Write one-off scripts that just to kind of get things done, because slowly you will get familiar with it's not about like learning every flag that there is for ls and cat and cut and all these command line utilities. It's not about that, right? It's about knowing what's possible. And when you're faced with a more complex task, it can very often be better to say, okay, I'm going to spend 5 minutes looking up on Stack Overflow and wherever else, how do I get this done? What's the best way to get this done? And it's likely that if you more or less know what the tools are able to do, that you can say, okay, so I'm not going to spend the next 3 hours manually indenting this file. I can just highlight the whole thing and press the equal sign in Vim, and Vim will do it for me. Knowing about those kinds of things, not necessarily how to do them on a day-to-day basis. It's not the biggest deal if you are doing if you're indenting and de-indenting yourself. But when you do need to do these larger tasks, it's important to feel comfortable with okay, I do have the ability to figure out ad hoc what my tools can do for me.
Yep, I completely agree. And a short aside, I was talking to a team member of mine about some of the some of the speed you can get to with Vim. You know, this person does appreciate a good hotkey, and I was like, well, Vim's really where you want to be at, and they're like, well, it's not that great. And I showed him a video of Gary Bernhardt, like a screencast, and they went, oh, I understand now. It's like there's a level of speed which you didn't think was possible. It's out there. That being said, that did remind me of a side effect or another thing very closely related to this, which is trying to think of how to say this without undermining what I just said before, which is especially when it comes to Unix. Like, I don't think there's, getting super fast at Bash might be something separate, but like if you are working in a Unix-based system and you're using something built on top of that, like you have drawers upon drawers of tools. You just have hundreds and hundreds of tools, and never learning them 5, 10, 15 years into your career is, again, like a carpenter who's like, well, I got one saw, I got one hammer, I don't really need, and they're just standing in a workshop full of tools. It's like, well, don't you want the belt grinder? It's a lot fast. No, that's silly. That's like, there is some benefit in, like, you need to realize what's out there. Like I said, learning what is available to you is a very different goal to helping you just enjoy your job more and be better at it than micro optimizing for speed here or speed there. Like I have like 100 probably small one-off little scripts that I've written that are either in my bash RC or they're just in my bin folder that I love them. I use them so often. People are always like asking for them. Like I've got like special Git subcommands that do tasks for me. And my favorite one is I wrote a new command called just UHH enter, and it just reprints the last 5 commands that I ran. Or if I do and then give it a word, it'll fuzzy find my whole history. So I'm like, I'll type Docker like all the time because I can never remember a Docker command. And then there it is right there in front of me. I'm like, oh, perfect. This saved me 15 minutes probably of having to find the exact Docker command I'm looking for. Yeah, so there's a balance, an art to the balance, I think.
Totally agree. That sounds like a cool script.
Yeah, I can. It's really small. I can send it to you. All right. So let's kind of round things out for the first half of the discussion here. Let's kind of quickly touch on chapter 4 and this idea of balancing our resources. We just talked about balancing how much we invest in our tools, but let's talk about the resources that we have.
Yeah. So balancing resources was basically about things like if you have a program that opens a file before, or let's say a method opens up a file before the method finishes, it should close the file, right? Anytime that you're using a resource, making sure that you're constantly returning to that initial state. Also building in checks to look for things like memory leaks. But what was interesting to me thinking about this is a case where it's really obvious that, like, from the machine's perspective, it doesn't care at what line in the program you close a file. It does care whether or not you close the file, but it doesn't care what line it happens, right? The reason that you're doing it within the same routine is because you as a programmer are not going to remember to close that file later. And that was sort of a really powerful thing to think about, that when we talk about all these different code quality techniques, they really all are very human things. They're about the things that we find difficult, the complexity that we have trouble handling. And like the fixes are very often, like just as an example, right? So I've worked a decent amount in Python recently. Ruby has something similar, but Python is probably a little bit more well-known in terms of the way it does this. Anytime you see a Python thing about a file, it will always say, it'll have a with, I don't know what the term is, block, I don't know. Basically, with open name of file as file, colon, indent, and then whatever you're gonna use the file for, and then when you hit the end of the indented stuff, it closes the file by itself. So this is built into a lot of different languages already, at least higher level languages, where Ruby, it's like file.open, and then you pass it a block, and then when the block finishes, it will always close the file. So languages are already building in these ideas in order to enforce the balancing of resources, but ultimately it's because it's easier for us as human beings to not have to think about it, to not have to remember, oh, I opened a file, now I'm going to close it. There are things that are much harder to to build into the language itself, but it's just one example of how languages can be built to help you write better code. To not leave openings. If you don't have explicit memory management, right? Like, why is garbage collection so awesome? It's theoretically a terrible idea because now the system has to do so much more extra work just to make sure that you're not, exploding memory all over the system. Except it turns out that we, as people, are really, really bad at finding all the memory that we're using and making sure to clean up after ourselves. We in general, as human beings, are bad at cleaning up after ourselves in a whole lot of ways. But in terms of memory use in programs, yeah, we have trouble with that. It's a high cognitive load, and that's why a lot of us have trouble writing programs in languages where there is explicit memory management. And garbage collectors are actually kind of great because at least if they're heavily optimized, they don't add too much to the system. They still add a good amount to the runtime, but hopefully not too much. And they take a significant amount of cognitive load off of the programmer. So it's really all about understanding the difficulties that we have as programmers and figuring out what are the fixes we can build into our languages and our frameworks and our tools in order to help us write better code when we actually have to use these tools.
Yep, I can't disagree with any of that. I think optimizing for lowering cognitive load needs to be like a really high priority for when we build systems for other programmers and for ourselves. That is something that I've been kind of gunning towards the last couple of years, as opposed to dryness or other things, which I've found over my career to be orthogonal, but not actually the goal. It's really easy, even single responsibility principle, which I think is really where you want to go in a lot of places. You can get distracted by the aesthetics of the code you're writing and lose sight of what is this causing for the people. Like, I've had several discussions with developers in the last year of, yes, you're writing 5 more lines of code in 8 places, but actually that's not worse code. It's not a replication of the intent of the system. It is a removing the ability or the implicit load you have to have as a developer. A big issue with Rails that you kind of have to come to grips with if you're teaching people who've never done Rails before is, yeah, there's so little code because it all has to be in your head. You have to keep track of everything in here, and you have to know all the conventions and have memorized the patterns and the way it does things to get the benefit of its not writing a lot of codeness. And I see the appeal. I've been doing Rails for over 8 years, and not to brag, I'm really good at Rails. Like, I'm really good at it. It helps that I built my own from scratch once or twice. So I built every section of Rails independently, from router to view renderer to controller architecture, just out of curiosity. And I know it really well. And my conclusion is, it's bad. Not in like, don't use Rails, it's bad. It's still the framework I use all the time. But when it comes to managing the cognitive load required, the amount of implicit things you need to have as soon as a developer, it's quite high. So what's the best advice we have is, extract all your logic out of Rails as quickly as you can and encapsulate it in small objects. That's good. Like, small objects are good. Good OO is good. Good functional programming goes to the same idea of encapsulating things so they're small to manage the very limited human resource, which is our own ability to focus and have attention with things. And I think memory management is a great analogy for how that actually transfers directly to how the system actually adheres, and it has limited resources, and we have to account for that. And I think it is good to see languages coming around that are, trying to take a new stab at this. With Rust's, well, we don't have a garbage collector, but we're not going to let you leak memory unless you do something really obscure, is a much nicer, more refreshing approach. Or some of the things that Elm language has done recently with like not allowing variable shadowing at the compiler level. It's like, hey, you declared A way up there. You can't declare A way down here because you're going to get confused. I guarantee it. And people are like, oh, I'll never get confused. And then they come back a week later. Hey, guess how many bugs I found when I fixed my code and removed all of the variable shadowing? I'm like, yeah, it's just a thing that naturally happens. So I don't know. I'm happy with this idea of trying to do that. Cool. Do we have any closing thoughts before we depart for the day? You excited for part 2?
Yeah, I mean, I've already started reading it. I think I mean, we had a discussion earlier this week already of chapter 5. So yeah, just excited to see what's in the remainder of the book. There's I guess a whole lot to being a pragmatic programmer. A lot of it is about programming, obviously. But I think what we've established in this conversation is that there's a lot of elements where you realize, like, wait a minute, well, even if it's about very, very technical things, they're always being built by people. And even being, technically excellent very often comes down to understanding the people who are, maybe not the people who are using the code, but at the very least the people who are building the code. And that's just as important.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm excited about part 2. I've skimmed a little bit of it ahead of time, and I read it forever ago. It's going to be another good discussion, and it is true that even though this is the most technical focused book, it's still humans are all the way through it. And I think a common thread we've mentioned is empathy is important. And I think that'll come up in part 2 as well. So I think we'll leave it there. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Don't forget, you can stay updated about Dev Empathy events by following us on Twitter @DevEmpathy. And of course, don't forget to join us on Slack for our weekly discussions that we have. And then don't forget to use the link on our site, devempathybook.club, if you'd like to join the Slack. We look forward to interacting with you and growing as a community as we become better developers and better people. All right. Bye.
Bye now.